My name is Cynthia Scott. As a worship associate on the Sunday services team, I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Indiana. UUs are a people of many beliefs and origins. People with a religious background, people with none, people who believe in a God, people who don't, and people who simply appreciate the mystery of life. We are people of diverse ethnicity, history, gender identities, and spirituality who come together on the side of love. We express our love in many compassionate ways within our immediate community and the wider world. We gather in spiritual community because we need a constant reminder of what matters most in life. In a world of heartbreak and dehumanization, our congregation calls us to our better selves. We learn to live with more wisdom, more connection, and more compassion. Our worship services are weekly reflections that weave together our own thoughts and experiences with music, beauty, poetry, and words that both inspire and challenge. We are inspired not just by religious sources, but by the people with whom we journey, the diverse and spirited Unitarian Universalists. Today, we are viewing and hearing the last of 6 personal spiritual journeys shared by members this summer. Our religious education leader, Adrienne Summerlot, is sharing her story titled Crossroads and Companions. Adrienne tells us of her life spanning an Irish Catholic upbringing and her moves to the Bible Belt and the Midwest. Along the way, she has found herself at crossroads in her own spiritual journey and has found that the companions along the way are just as important as the journey on the road. Spiritual journeys are all about connection and community. I appreciate the chance to get better acquainted with a fellow church member while working with them on a team or committee. I get a sense of how dedicated they are, how their skills add to our shared goals, and what they bring to the project from their experiences. I also like to chat with a member or two during coffee hour after our Sunday service. Before the COVID pandemic, we could often get together at social events and learn more about each other while having fun. But even at those events, I didn't always get a sense of where a person came from, their history, or their focus in life. I saw that same kind of connection gap between the co-workers I met while serving my last 5 years of military duty in Washington, D.C. Many of us called to work at the Air National Guard Logistics Center, a 6-story building, were assigned there for only a few years. When I arrived, it had been 1 year since the 9/11 attack. Our mission was to ensure all the supplies, equipment, and personnel needed for the Iraq War would get there in a timely and efficient manner. I did not get an idea of where or how many of those people came from until, and unless, they were retiring as they finished their tour of duty. At that point, they would have an elaborate retirement ceremony. I had one too, where they spoke about themselves and their career. It was too little and too late to fully appreciate them. Thank goodness we do not have that tradition here. Instead, we learn about each other while we are still together and active in practicing our UUCCI mission and goals. Come, let us share another spiritual journey.
At the Wellhead by Seamus Heaney. Your songs, when you sing them with your two eyes closed, as you always do, are like a local road we've known every turn of in the past. That midge-veiled, high-hedged side road where you stood, looking and listening until a car would come and go and leave you lonelier than you had been to begin with. So sing on, dear shut-eyed one, dear far-voiced veteran. Sing yourself to where the singing comes from, ardent and cut off like our blind neighbor who played the piano all day in her bedroom. Her notes came out to us like hoisted water, raveling off a bucket at the wellhead, where next thing we'd be listening, hushed and awkward. That blind from birth, sweet-voiced, withdrawn musician was like a silver vein in heavy clay, night water glittering in the light of day, but also just our neighbor, Rosie Keenan. She touched our cheeks. She let us touch her braille. In books, like books wallpaper patterns come in, her hands were active and her eyes were full of open darkness and of watery shine. She knew us by our voices. She'd say she saw whoever or whatever. Being with her was intimate and helpful, like a cure you didn't notice happening. When I read a poem with Keenan's well in it, she said, I can see the sky at the bottom of it now.
How I Go to the Woods by Mary Oliver. Ordinarily, I go to the woods alone, with not a single friend, for they are all smilers and talkers, and therefore unsuitable. I don't really want to be witnessed talking to the catbirds or hugging the old black oak tree. I have my way of praying, as you no doubt have yours. Besides, when I'm alone, I can become invisible. I can sit on the top of a dune, as motionless as an uprise of weeds, until the foxes run by, unconcerned. I can hear the almost unhearable sound of the roses singing. If you have ever gone to the woods with me, I must love you very much.
I grew up in a small town in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. In fact, my parents still live in the same house they brought me home from the hospital in. I grew up a short drive to a few lakes and the ocean, infamous boardwalks, an hour from Philly, and a 2-hour train ride to New York City. having this accessibility really was formative in my upbringing. And I still hold a lot of that in my soul now in the experiences I seek for myself and for my kids. My parents were both raised Catholic. They had a very traditional Catholic wedding. And while my brothers and I were also raised Catholic, I wouldn't quite describe our family of 5 as devout. They were more, let's go through the motions, stay in God's good graces by behaving properly, and show up on the big days like Christmas and Easter. I am the youngest of 3 children and the baby by 10 and 12 years. I remember vividly going to 4 p.m. Mass on Saturdays at St. John's Catholic Church. During my elementary years, those Catholic services were really geared for families on Saturday. We had a very charismatic young priest in training. He was a man of color and he was from the Caribbean. I looked so forward to the times that he got to lead service. They weren't dull and boring like some of the other priests. Instead, he always seemed to have a story that spoke right to my heart. And he encouraged us to laugh and to sing. However, in contrast, I did spend a lot of my Wednesday nights kind of off in the children's wing at CCD. And I loathed that time, if I'm going to be honest. And there I had to learn and memorize doctrine. I was discouraged from asking questions. And it was drilled into me that God was all knowing. And if I wanted to avoid purgatory, I would follow the rules and obey God and my parents. I think that might have been the first time that seeds were really planted in my mind that I did not always believe what they were telling me that I had to believe. So at about that age, I was probably about 8 years old. That's around the time when you traditionally make your first communion. So knowing that this is a big deal, knowing how important this is to my family, I played the role of a good daughter and made my first Holy Communion to both my parents and my grandparents' delight. I remember wearing all white, the dress, the veil, the ritual of receiving the first Holy Eucharist after making my first confession, receiving my first Holy Rosary and my first Bible. Not that we were encouraged to actually read the Bible, though, as Catholics. I think it will become very clear throughout this brief time we have together, and if you ever have any honest conversations with me, how critical my paternal grandmother, Christina, was in my life. You'll hear me refer to her simply as Gram. My Gram was a first-generation American and a devout Catholic. Her mother, Frida, emigrated from Germany, and her father, Joseph, from Ireland. She was one of 10 children who survived to adulthood. The names of my great aunts and uncles are typical of those you heard in large Irish Catholic families. Mary, Christina, Joseph, Patrick, Aloysius, Francis, Rita, Catherine, Teresa, and Agnes. My great aunt Agnes, in fact, was a nun before I was born. There's photos of her throwing a baseball to my dad in her habit. My Gram came of age in the Great Depression and saw her husband off to war, where it truly was a miracle that he returned home alive. Through ongoing conversations with my Gram throughout my life, and as I've become an adult and a mother, I understand how those experiences impacted her commitment to Catholicism, and in turn, my own spirituality. I spent a good chunk of time at my grandparents' house in the summers. They came down to our house at least one Sunday a month, if not more, and it often involved going to church together. When I was up there visiting, I would go to Our Lady of Peace Catholic Church on the corner of Ford and Amboy Avenues. My grandparents' church was much more traditional than our church. You dare not be late or consider leaving early. There weren't jokes. Part of the Mass was even in Latin. And if I'm being honest, that was around the time that I started to daydream as I looked at art and architecture and out the stained glass windows. My gram was the one who taught me what it meant to be a Catholic, and largely the reason I stayed connected to the faith so long. We would watch EWTN and Mother Angelica in the evening and contemplate a joyful or sorrowful mystery, and then pray the rosary together. She kept a card to remind her of people or things that she wanted to pray for. And something I noticed about my grandmother was that she wasn't praying for them in fear or sorrow, but rather in hope and in love. Catholicism for my grandmother was as life-sustaining as her pot of Irish tea. And while my views of the religion would deviate from hers over time, it was really clear that we could stay in relationship and in conversation. And she even understood where I was in my conflict, even if she didn't agree with the conflict. She would say, "Honey girl, I don't know who is right or wrong about religion, if there even is a right or a wrong. All I know is what is right for me, and I will see when I meet my maker." Well, as I got older, those seeds began to grow through conversations with my childhood friends, especially through music and experiences that we shared. I was discovering my identity as a feminist. In the neighborhood of my childhood home on Houston Street, Robin and Mary Ellen and I knew the words to every Salt and Pepper song, and we would sing them loudly and proudly, even though I don't sing in key, as a protest against the patriarchy. My chosen sister, Tammy, who I've known my entire life, and other friends along the way, found music and poetry as reflective tools. They empowered us with ways to wrestle with these really complex ideas that were in our religious upbringing and what we were being faced with, the modern day issues as girls growing into young women, which seemed to be at odds with each other. Another companion who was pivotal in my life is Charlotte. Our families were friends, and she was older than my brothers, which placed her in this really interesting role that shifted and changed as we grew together. She kind of started as my cool young aunt, and then that shifted to my big sister and mentor and best friend at the end of our time together. Charlotte was also raised Catholic. And while she held that spirituality throughout, she also didn't fit neat and tidy into any certain boxes. She had an incomparable zest for life, embraced fun and spontaneity, and had a smile and a laugh that would light up a room. She was definitely a trusted adult in my life, and nothing was off the table for our conversations. One of the first important conversations I had was that I didn't want to keep going to CCD and go through Catholic confirmation. I knew I had to tell my parents, and was also afraid because that just isn't something you do. And yet, with all the fibers of my being, I also didn't want to stand up there in front of all of those people and lie and say that I believed in something that I absolutely didn't. I can remember having these conversations with Charlotte and her encouraging me to talk to my gram.
Her logic was to just circumvent my parents and go directly to the matriarch of the family. And I trusted Charlotte, and she was right. In a recent conversation with my mom as I was getting ready for the spiritual journey, she admitted to having absolutely no clue of all those things that went on in my preparation for talking to them. But she said, I just remember how strongly and passionately that you felt and that you came to us in such a respectful manner. So I didn't go through confirmation as so many of my friends and as my older brothers did. And I might say pretty honestly, and I don't think they disagree, that my brothers still hold a little bit of a grudge about me getting out of going to church. They will tell you it is because I was the baby and the only girl. I am still convinced it was because I was much more persistent and I made a compelling case that my parents could not counter. Yet, I am the one who is a professional religious educator now. And I spend more time in church than my parents or my brothers to this day. My first nephew was born in October of my freshman year of high school. And my pop-pop was killed by a drunk driver the following March. If I hadn't already grown disconnected from my religious faith, that loss fueled it. I watched the women in my family gather around this beautiful baby for his baptism the day after we laid my pop-pop to rest. Throughout those days, I remember singing and listening to rousing renditions of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, Tura, Laura, Laura, and The Parting Glass. In Irish tradition, whether starting life or ending life, there was always food, family, singing, stories, and jokes. I can't repeat most of the jokes I learned from my uncles and great uncles. They aren't fit for church, even a UU one. Before my father left me on my own in my dorm room, he encouraged me to consider venturing out to the free concert at the amphitheater. My roommate Rachel and I actually attempted it, but we didn't have a map, and we feared we were, as city dwellers, lost on this big agricultural campus because we were starting to get near the busy roads. So we headed back. Fortunately, some other girls down the hall had been there longer and were much more comfortable with the campus and invited me to tag along when they ventured out a little later. And so I went to the free concert with my friends, and we saw a guy sitting all by himself. And me, never believing in the idea of a stranger, said we should go and say hi to the guy. Well, quickly, he and I kind of hit it off and started talking, and my friends ditched me. And so there I was talking to the guy. And a long story short, that guy's been my best friend ever since, and we've been married for 21 years. I promise I'll tell you more about John. But I have to tell you about John. It's so much an Irish thing here of like spinning a good yarn. But I have to tell you that I met John, so I can tell you that that's how I met Billy. So Billy is 2 years younger than John. And he and John went to high school in Huntsville, Alabama. But Billy went straight to college, and John went straight into the United States Marine Corps. And so here we happen to be at Mississippi State University, Billy 2 years into his college work, and John and I both freshmen with a 4-year age difference, and Billy kind of sandwiched in the middle. So the interesting thing about Billy is essentially I met him 2 weeks later than I met my future husband. And Billy's an important person. Billy is become a shared best friend of John and I, and is our children's godfather and chosen uncle. But what's really interesting about the friendship is he and I were both solid friends. I grew up with brothers. I needed a guy friend in my life. And so there we were. He also was a science major and he had a Catholic upbringing, but he was hardcore. Okay. He was an altar boy and he sang in the choir. And so over the 24 years we've been friends, we've had a lot of conversations as we try to reconcile what we were taught, undo our ideas that were wrapped in guilt, and discern our own paths forward. And I'm really lucky to have him with me along this journey. And with our kids. He is now a trusted adult in our children's lives. So there in Mississippi State University, on the corner of Walker Road and Lee Boulevard, is the beautiful Chapel of Memories. It became a spiritual home for me through much of college. Now, wait, Adrienne, didn't you just tell us how much you fought to get out of church, that you weren't really Catholic and all that? Yeah. Okay. You're not mishearing things, but here's what I figured out. I was here deep in the buckle of the Bible Belt, as some people called it. And I kept encountering new people who would later become very, very dear friends to me, but who had an intimate and seemingly direct relationship with Jesus. Okay, this was really foreign to me. There's a comedian named Kathleen Madigan, and she shares in her stand-up routine that as Catholics, we were taught to never bother Jesus. We had a whole slew of saints with specific specialty areas, right? I've prayed to, St. Anthony because I have lost things. I often thought my grandmother was keeping him busy with her own tasks. But we had our saints, we had our angels. Heck, you have your own guardian angel who's assigned to you 24/7 wherever you are. But we were never, ever to bother Jesus. So here, 1,000 miles away from home, in a sea of what it seemed to be Protestant religion, where so many people openly said prayers at every meal, called Jesus into conversations, and feeling like a fish out of water, I found folks who seemed to get me. There I was, an Irish Catholic girl from New Jersey in Starkville, Mississippi. And as much as I wanted to separate myself from that identity on some levels, it's also what helped ground me in others. Plus, this was different from either of the Catholic churches I had frequented in my childhood. First off, Mass was on Sunday evening, and they had a rock band, okay? And on Wednesday night, the rosary was followed by a dinner of lasagna. Where was I going to find people who could make good Italian food in Mississippi? The Catholic Church. So you could say I met Father Mike at a significant crossroads in my life. Again, like that priest of my childhood, he knew his audience. Father Michael O'Brien had emigrated from Ireland and volunteered to go to Mississippi, of all places. He spoke with Irish brogue, and he evoked a bit of Sean Connery, and he had this warm smile, and his eyes twinkled with the same spunk and kindness of my great aunts and uncles. It felt like home. He started every Mass with a joke, and his messages always seemed relevant. Honestly, it happened by circumstance that our paths even crossed. The Catholic Church in town had burned down, and while it was being rebuilt, they held student services on campus, which is what allowed me to listen and to find myself there. Having a place that felt holy without the guilt of the crucifix in front of me allowed me to listen to the message more deeply. Having worship offered to me with music and story centered again spoke to my heart. Back to John, who happens to be a third-generation agnostic. While originally a pre-veterinary student like myself, he ended up pursuing history, philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. Talk about someone who's committed to being a lifelong learner. John found religion and spirituality very interesting and jumped at the opportunity to go to Mass with me. He used to call it Catharobics. He was thrilled that he knew when to get up and when to kneel, and he wore it like a badge. Over the years, we have racked up many, many miles on the road, and the conversations we have had have been both incredibly deep and wide. He is one of the only people I know who has actually read the Bible from cover to cover, and he has a book of notes he has taken. So while I was nervous about introducing him to Graham, he earned some major cred with her, and we had her blessing. I might have stayed in Mississippi a day too long, according to Cheryl Crow. We moved to Indiana when our first child was just 4 months old. Here I was, again, a fish out of water. Born and raised in New Jersey for 18 years. Doing a stint in the Bible Belt for 8 years. And now at the crossroads of America with a baby. John was working for Indiana University as the residence director of McNutt Center. I was feeling overwhelmed, isolated, unmoored. I wanted to work, but I also was the stay-at-home parent. Fortunately, the Unitarian Universalist Church right down the street happened to be hiring for childcare staff. It was part-time, but it would help me meet people, and I could bring our daughter with me. There was only one problem. I had no idea what a Unitarian Universalist Church was, and thought I might want to research this before I consider applying and going. And while the internet was around, Google wasn't quite as popular as it is now. But fortunately, I was married to someone who was a walking encyclopedia with this sort of knowledge. So I guess you might say my relationship with UU began there at the corner of Fee Lane and State Road 45 in Bloomington, Indiana. As I started working there, I got to know the kids and the families first. And I loved what I saw, heard, and felt. It was there that I realized the kids were anchored in this understanding that while they themselves might be really little, how they showed up, what they chose to do, how they were in relationship with each other really impacted the world. And for them to be so keenly aware of that at such a young age was extremely compelling and inspiring. And so as I kept coming home and talking to John, he decided to explore the church on his own and go to some services. And when I wasn't working, I would try to join him. After the birth of our second daughter, I took on additional work as the part-time assistant to the director of religious education, which invited me to learn even more about Unitarian Universalism as I'd prepare materials and support monthly family worship. I grew more and more interested in UU and appreciated how it allowed me to heal and also hold on to some of the things I held dear about my Catholic upbringing. And for John, it was free of the dogma that he needed as an agnostic. We decided that this would be a good fit, not only for he and I, but for our family, for our children, so that they would have a foundation. Over the years, I worked with volunteers and staff who taught me so much about what it means to be anchored in community and, more importantly, in covenant. After the arrival of our son, I stepped back from working at the church due to full-time work at the YMCA. But interestingly, that actually allowed John and I to take a more in-depth class about Unitarian Universalism and sign the membership book, become actual full-fledged members of the congregation. And eventually, I was asked to return to the church as the director of religious education and had the honor of serving there for many years. Now here, my friends, is where it gets a little funny. As I started to learn more and more about UU for my work, I got into the history of Unitarians and Universalists. So some of you might know this story and some of you might not, but John Murray was born in England. His family relocated to Cork, Ireland, which also happens to be where my great-grandfather is from. Murray returned to England and embraced Universalist teachings, but was excommunicated as a result. In 1770, he emigrated to lose himself in America and preached as a Universalist minister. His first sermon in Good Luck, which is now Lacey Township, New Jersey. That happened on September 30th, 1770. He resided there as a patron and a friend of Thomas Potter until 1774. Today, that farm is the site of Murray Grove Retreat and Renewal Center. That birthplace of Universalism in the United States just so happened to be less than a 30-minute drive from my childhood home. And I had no idea. Like, I'm talking 10 years ago, I think I figured this out. And while I still haven't been there, I do hope to visit. Like I said, funny how it all works out. Throughout my work as a professional religious educator, I have had to become more comfortable in articulating my faith, making UU accessible to all ages, supporting volunteers and welcoming newcomers. John and I were both trained as our whole life sexuality educators, and providing comprehensive, holistic sexual education continues to be a passion of my work. Our 3 children have been raised through UU. As a result, our family conversations are quite interesting, and it has been a privilege to witness how it has allowed us to engage more honestly and directly with our children than we did with our parents. It isn't always roses, though. John has laughed with me when I am frustrated at the lack of being able to use guilt or repercussions beyond this earthly plane as a parenting tool. We joke that raising children who are anchored in Unitarian Universalism is not for the faint of heart. In this faith, we are encouraged to be independent thinkers and critical thinkers, and it is indeed what attracted us to UU. The fact that you can find 3 folks in coffee hour and one will agree with what the minister said, one will disagree with what the minister said, and one will be somewhere in the middle, not sure of where the sermon's landing that day. And yet they can all be in conversation with one another. It's really something to observe. This past week, I was on study leave, and some of the lyrics from the band Emma's Revolution were really sticking with me, and I was carrying them around while I was on Star Island. We shall be known by the company we keep. In this great turning, we shall learn to lead with love. Out in the middle of nowhere, in Salem, Indiana, at Oakwood Retreat Center, I have had some of the most spiritually reflective and cup-filling moments of my adult life as a UU. I owe that largely due to my colleagues and friends who gather. I have learned to listen deeply, challenge myself to be quiet, and believe me, that's a challenge. We walk among tall trees. We sing hymns and silos. We dance around a fire. We create art and drum together. We believe in sharing our truths and holding each other tenderly in this work. Through this sacred work, as a religious educator, I met the Reverend Nick Cable. I think it might have been in Denver. We'll have to narrow that down and make sure. But Nick is also a rapid thinker like myself, and he's anchored in collaborative leadership. And so when he asked me to join you all here at UUCCI, I jumped at the opportunity. It is hard to believe that I have only been with you for a year, but I look forward to many, many more together. Please allow me to bring my spiritual journey full circle. This blessing is a traditional Irish blessing I was taught as a child, and happily it was brought back to me when I became a religious educator. My dear colleague Shannon Harper adapted it and taught it to us. We would sing this at youth cons at the end as we're passing around balls of yarn and remembering how connected we were. And we would also do this when we would gather for our beloved retreats and shared collegial time. If you know it, I encourage you to join me. And I hope you will give me grace, as I do not have the voice of an angel. May the road rise with you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rains fall softly on your fields. Until we meet again, may love hold you in the hollow of their hand.
Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way. All will go from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night.